What if your final moments stretched not into hours, but into 53 days of unimaginable agony? What if, as the most powerful monarch in the world, you were forced to watch your own body decompose while still alive, your flesh consumed by worms as courtiers whispered prayers outside your chamber? This is not fiction. This is not medieval legend. This is the documented death of Philip II of Spain, the man who once commanded an empire where the sun never set, reduced to a rotting vessel of suffering that would haunt the annals of medical history forever. In the summer of 1598, inside the austere walls of El Escorial Palace, a smell began to permeate the corridors. It was not the scent of decay from some forgotten corner, but the living putrefaction of a king. Philip II, ruler of Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, vast territories in the Americas and the Philippines, named in his honor, lay dying in a manner so grotesque that even hardened physicians recoiled. His body had become a battleground where worms waged war against royal flesh, and the king remained conscious through nearly every excruciating moment. This is the story of how absolute power met absolute mortality. How a man who controlled continents could not control the corruption of his own body. How faith, pride, and medieval medicine conspired to prolong suffering beyond human comprehension. This is the story of 53 days that redefined what it means to die. Philip II of Spain was born in 1527 into the most powerful dynasty Europe had ever known. His father, Charles V, ruled the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip inherited an empire so vast it was said the sun never set on Spanish territories. He controlled Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, parts of Italy, the Philippines, and vast swaths of the Americas, where gold and silver flowed into Spanish coffers in seemingly endless streams. He was the champion of Catholic Europe, the architect of the Spanish Armada, and a man who saw himself as God's instrument on earth. But power of this magnitude came with crushing responsibility. Philip micromanaged his empire from a desk at El Escorial, reading and signing thousands of documents personally. He trusted few and delegated less. The weight of empire pressed upon him physically and psychologically. He slept little, ate poorly, and spent hours each day in prayer and paperwork. His lifestyle was sedentary to the extreme, a fact that would have catastrophic consequences for his health. By his late 60s, Philip's body had begun to rebel. He suffered from gout, a painful condition caused by uric acid crystals forming in the joints, particularly excruciating in the feet and hands. For a man who had always maintained rigid control, the loss of physical mobility must have been deeply disturbing. But gout was merely the opening act of his medical nightmare. In the spring of 1598, Philip developed what physicians initially diagnosed as tertian fever, likely malaria, which was still present in parts of Spain. He also suffered from dropsy, the old term for edema, massive fluid retention that caused his legs and abdomen to swell grotesquely. But these conditions, terrible as they were, paled compared to what emerged next. Lesions began appearing on Philip's body. At first they seemed like bed sores, unfortunate but manageable consequences of his immobility. The king had been largely bedridden for months, his gouty joints making movement agony, his swollen body difficult to maneuver. But these wounds refused to heal. Instead, they grew larger, deeper, more numerous. The physicians applied the standard treatments of the era: poultices, herbal compounds, prayers. Nothing worked. The lesions continued to spread and deepen, exposing raw flesh. It was late July 1598 when the true horror began. Philip had been moved to his favored chamber in El Escorial, a small austere room with a window overlooking the chapel altar. He wanted to see the host elevated during Mass to maintain his connection to God even as his body failed. He had ruled from this palace fortress, this monument to his faith and power, and here he would die. But no one, not even Philip himself, imagined what the next 53 days would bring. The smell came first, a sweet, rotten odor that no amount of incense could mask. Then something that seemed impossible, something that violated the very concept of royal dignity. The physicians noticed movement in the king's wounds. Not the pulse of blood or the twitch of damaged tissue. The deliberate, hungry movement of larvae, worms, maggots. The King of Spain, anointed by God, defender of Catholicism, ruler of the greatest empire since Rome, had become host to creatures that fed on carrion. His body, still living, still conscious, had become their feeding ground. The medical team, led by his chief physician, was confronted with a situation beyond their training. Medieval and Renaissance medicine had little understanding of infection, no concept of bacteria, and certainly no precedent for treating a living king whose body was decomposing. They tried everything in their limited arsenal. They changed dressings constantly, applied caustic substances to kill the larvae, used herbal preparations that had been passed down through generations. Nothing worked. For every worm they removed, more appeared. Modern medical historians examining the accounts of Philip's death have attempted to diagnose what actually afflicted him. The most likely explanation involves a combination of factors that created a perfect storm of suffering. Philip probably had severe diabetes, which would explain the poor wound healing, the edema, and the infections. Diabetes was not understood in 1598, but its effects were all too visible. Combined with his immobility, diabetes would cause pressure sores that quickly became infected. In the warm summer months with limited sanitation, even in a royal palace, these infected wounds would attract flies. Female flies would lay eggs in the necrotic tissue. Within hours, larvae would emerge and begin feeding on dead and dying flesh. The maggots would burrow deeper, creating larger wounds, exposing more tissue to infection and further infestation. It was a vicious cycle, and Philip was trapped in the center of it. But here is what makes Philip's suffering so particularly horrific. The maggots were likely eating mostly dead tissue, which meant they were not causing all the pain. The real agony came from the infections, the fever, the systemic toxicity of a body slowly poisoning itself, and the bedsores that developed wherever his body touched the mattress. Every position was agony. Every movement, when it was possible at all, brought fresh waves of pain. And through it all, Philip remained conscious and aware. Contemporary accounts describe the king's suffering in terrible detail. Fray José de Sigüenza, the palace librarian and one of Philip's confidants, maintained detailed records. He wrote of how the king's entire back became one massive, suppurating wound, the flesh rotting away until the bones of his spine were visible. The stench became so overwhelming that servants had to rotate frequently, unable to bear it for long periods. The king's legs swelled to enormous proportions from the dropsy. The skin stretched so tight it split open, weeping fluid constantly. These new wounds also became infested. Philip could not sit up, could not turn without assistance, could not perform any bodily function without aid. His dignity, which he had maintained so carefully throughout his reign, was stripped away completely. His physicians tried to drain the excess fluid, using techniques that were essentially medieval torture. They made incisions in his legs to allow the accumulated fluid to escape. These new wounds, of course, also became infected and infested. Each attempt to provide relief created new avenues for suffering. The chamber where Philip lay became a bizarre intersection of the sacred and the profane. While monks chanted prayers in shifts, never letting the sound of devotion cease, servants fought a losing battle against the corruption of the royal body. They changed linens constantly, though moving the king even slightly caused him to cry out in pain. They applied fresh poultices, knowing they would be saturated with pus and blood within hours. They picked maggots from wounds with tweezers, a task that must have been as psychologically devastating as it was physically repulsive. Philip, for his part, tried to maintain his faith and his composure. He had always been a deeply religious man, perhaps obsessively so. He saw his suffering as a test from God, perhaps as penance for his sins, or as a trial to purify his soul before death. He requested that monks read to him constantly from religious texts. He asked for relics to be brought to him, sacred objects that he hoped might provide comfort or intercession. The priests surrounding him reinforced this interpretation of his suffering. They told him that his pain was uniting him with Christ's suffering on the cross. They suggested that God was testing his faith, preparing him for paradise. Whether this brought Philip comfort or added psychological torment to his physical agony, we cannot know. But he clung to these interpretations because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. That his suffering was meaningless, that he was simply a body failing in the most horrible way possible, with no divine purpose behind it. News of the king's condition spread slowly through the palace, then to Madrid, then across Spain, and eventually throughout Europe. The empire waited for word of his death, but death seemed to take its time arriving. Ambassadors sent regular dispatches to their courts. "The king is dying," they wrote. "The king will not survive the week. The king continues in agony." Week after week, the reports continued, each one describing a man who should have died but somehow remained alive. The medical consensus was that Philip should not have survived more than a few days in his condition. The infection alone should have killed him. The toxicity from the rotting tissue, the fever, the dehydration from constant fluid loss, the inability to eat properly, any one of these factors should have been fatal. Yet Philip lingered, trapped in a body that was simultaneously alive and dead. By the second week of August, the situation had deteriorated even further. The wounds on Philip's back had expanded until they merged into a single massive ulcer. Witnesses reported that you could see his vertebrae through the rotting flesh. The smell had become so powerful that it pervaded not just his room, but the entire wing of the palace. Servants covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs, but nothing could truly mask the odor of a living man decomposing. The psychological impact on those attending the king cannot be overstated. Imagine being a servant or physician required to handle this royal body, to touch flesh that was crawling with worms, to change bandages soaked in pus and blood, to look into the eyes of a conscious man trapped in this living nightmare. Some servants requested to be released from their duties, though such requests were largely denied. This was the king, and duty demanded they attend him, no matter how horrible the task. Philip himself began to despair, though he tried to hide it behind prayers and pious statements. He asked repeatedly why God was prolonging his suffering. He wondered aloud if he had committed some terrible sin that required such extreme punishment. His confessors worked constantly to maintain his faith, to prevent him from falling into despair, which was considered a mortal sin in Catholic theology. Even in dying, even in unimaginable pain, Philip was expected to maintain proper religious devotion. The king's family visited regularly, though these visits must have been traumatic for all involved. Philip's son, the future Philip III, came to his father's bedside and was visibly shaken by what he saw. The young prince was being prepared to inherit the empire, but seeing his father in this state must have provided a terrifying lesson about the ultimate powerlessness of even the mightiest monarch. Philip's daughters also visited, though accounts suggest their visits were brief and carefully managed. The sight of their father, the man who had ruled with such authority and command, reduced to a rotting, worm-infested invalid, must have been almost incomprehensible. Some historians suggest that these family visits were as much for political necessity as emotional comfort. The heir and his siblings needed to be seen attending the dying king to establish continuity and legitimacy. As August turned into September, Philip's suffering entered its most acute phase. The infections had spread systemically. He developed high fevers that left him delirious at times, though he always seemed to return to full consciousness, perhaps unfortunately. His kidneys began to fail, adding new dimensions to his suffering. The bloating from fluid retention became even more extreme. His abdomen swelled enormously, the skin stretched and shiny, adding to his inability to breathe comfortably. The physicians tried increasingly desperate measures. They applied leeches to draw out bad blood, following the medical theory of humors that dominated Renaissance medicine. This only weakened Philip further and created more wounds that became infested. They tried various poisons and caustic substances on the wounds to kill the maggots, but these burned the exposed flesh and added chemical burns to his catalog of suffering. They attempted to reposition the king regularly to prevent new bed sores from forming, but this was nearly impossible. Any movement caused him to scream in agony. His back was one large wound, so lying on it was torture. His sides developed sores as well. There was literally no position in which Philip could lie that did not cause terrible pain. The servants devised systems of pillows and cushions, trying to distribute his weight, but nothing truly helped. During this time, Philip maintained something that seems almost superhuman: his mental clarity. Despite the pain, despite the fever, despite the horror of his situation, he continued to handle matters of state when possible. He signed documents. He gave orders. He dictated instructions for his successor. His mind remained sharp even as his body rotted, perhaps the cruelest aspect of his suffering. A man in his condition should have been delirious, unconscious, spared by the mercy of mental oblivion. But Philip remained aware, awake, experiencing every moment of his decomposition. The religious observances in the palace intensified as September progressed. The monks' prayers became more urgent. Multiple masses were said daily for the king's soul. Relics were brought from across Spain. Pieces of the true cross, bones of saints, sacred objects that had supposedly worked miracles. They were placed near Philip's bed, touched to his fevered skin, held before his eyes. He kissed them with cracked, bleeding lips, hoping for relief that never came. Philip began to make his final arrangements with increasing urgency. He dictated his will, though most of it had been prepared years before. He gave specific instructions about his funeral, about masses to be said for his soul, about the distribution of his personal effects. He seemed to sense correctly that his death was finally approaching, though even he could not have imagined how much longer his ordeal would continue. By mid-September, witnesses reported that Philip's body was more dead than alive. Large portions of his flesh had completely necrotized. The maggot infestation had become so severe that the physicians gave up trying to remove them, focusing instead on keeping the king as comfortable as possible. though comfortable is perhaps the wrong word for someone in his condition. The best they could offer were slight reductions in pain through various herbal preparations and opiates, though these had limited effect. The king's appetite had vanished completely. He could barely swallow. When he tried to eat, he often vomited, adding to the indignity and discomfort. His body was consuming itself, the infection and fever burning through what little reserves remained. He was wasting away even as parts of him swelled grotesquely from fluid retention and infection. His face became gaunt, his eyes sunken, creating a skull-like appearance that terrified those who saw him. Yet still he lingered. Day after day the vigil continued. The empire held its breath. Ambassadors' reports took on an almost surreal quality as they struggled to describe a situation that seemed to defy belief. "The king is still alive," they wrote. "The king continues to suffer. The king should have died weeks ago, but remains conscious and aware." Modern physicians reading these accounts struggle to explain Philip's prolonged survival. The human body has remarkable resilience, but there are limits. Philip had passed those limits weeks earlier. Some medical historians suggest he may have had an unusually strong heart and constitution. Ironic given his many other health problems. Others wonder if the detailed accounts exaggerated the timeline or the severity of his condition, though multiple independent sources corroborate the basic facts. The most likely explanation is that Philip's suffering was prolonged by the very treatments meant to help him. Medieval medicine's emphasis on keeping patients alive at any cost, combined with Philip's own determination to remain conscious and in control, may have prevented his body from shutting down mercifully. Modern medicine recognizes that sometimes the kindest treatment is to allow nature to take its course, to provide comfort rather than aggressive intervention. But in 1598, that approach was not considered, especially not for a king. As the calendar turned to the second half of September, Philip's condition somehow stabilized at a horrific new equilibrium. He was not getting better, but he seemed to have reached a state where he could neither heal nor die. His wounds continued to suppurate. The maggots continued their work. The fever came and went. He remained conscious more often than unconscious. It was a kind of living death, a state that should not have been possible but somehow was. During this period, Philip displayed what many witnesses described as an almost supernatural patience and faith. He did not rage against his fate, at least not publicly. He accepted communion as regularly as his condition allowed and participated in prayers and religious ceremonies whenever he could. He maintained the appearance of royal dignity even as his body violated every principle of human dignity. Yet there were moments when the mask slipped, when the pain overwhelmed him, when the king became simply a suffering man. He cried out during the night, begged for relief, and questioned why God had abandoned him. These moments were dutifully recorded by the priests and servants in attendance, offering a glimpse of the human being beneath the crown, a man in agony beyond bearing. The chamber itself took on an otherworldly atmosphere. Constant prayers, the smell of incense mixed with decay, the dim light filtering through heavy curtains, and the steady movement of monks, physicians, and servants performing their prescribed routines around the dying king. It resembled a scene from a medieval passion play, except the suffering was real and lasted far longer than any performance. Outside the palace, life continued. The empire's business could not stop even for a dying king. Philip III was already assuming more responsibilities, preparing for a transition that seemed imminent but never quite arrived. The Spanish court existed in a strange limbo, caught between the reign of a living king who could not rule and a successor who could not yet ascend the throne. On September 10, 50 days into his final ordeal, Philip received extreme unction, the last rites of the Catholic Church. The ceremony was elaborate, with dozens of clerics participating in the ritual meant to prepare his soul for death. The king was anointed with holy oil, blessed repeatedly, and granted final absolution for his sins. This rite was intended as a prelude to death, usually performed when the end was hours or at most days away. But Philip did not die. September 10th passed, then September 11th, then September 12th. The king lingered on, having received the last rites but somehow unable or unwilling to release his hold on life. It was unprecedented. The clergy were troubled by the religious implications. Could the sacrament be repeated? Had it failed? Was God refusing to accept Philip's soul? The answer came at last on September 13, 1598, 53 days after the beginning of his documented final illness and 71 years after his birth. Philip II of Spain died. The accounts say he passed quietly without struggle, as if his body had simply decided it had endured enough. The prayers that had continued day and night shifted from pleas for mercy to expressions of thanksgiving for release. The immediate aftermath of Philip's death was carefully choreographed. The heir was notified and ambassadors were dispatched across Europe. The machinery of succession, prepared for months, finally moved into action. But first came the matter of the king's body. The corpse of Philip II was in such catastrophic condition that the usual procedures for handling royal remains were impossible. The flesh was too decomposed, too infected, too infested for traditional preparation. The embalmer faced an unprecedented challenge. Typically, a royal body would be treated with care, preserved, dressed in regal garments, and displayed for public viewing. None of this could be done with Philip. The body was washed as well as could be managed, a horrific task, while priests performed their blessings. It was then wrapped in multiple layers of cloth soaked in preservatives and aromatics, intended as much to contain the smell as to preserve the remains. Philip was sealed in his coffin quickly, far more quickly than protocol demanded. There would be no lying in state, no public viewing. The condition of the body made it impossible. The funeral proceeded with proper royal pomp, though all present were uncomfortably aware of the true state of the remains inside the sealed coffin. Philip was interred in the royal pantheon at El Escorial, the palace monastery he had built, where his tomb remains to this day beneath the altar he had watched from his window during his final terrible weeks. The historical records of Philip's death are unusually detailed, both because of his status and because of the sheer duration and horror of his dying. Multiple eyewitnesses left accounts. The royal physicians kept detailed notes, hoping to understand what had happened and perhaps learn from it, though their conclusions were filtered through the medical misunderstandings of their era. The priests maintained records as part of their duties. Together, these accounts, cross-referenced and corroborated, depict a level of suffering that seems almost beyond human endurance. Modern analysis of Philip's death adds further context and possible diagnoses, though it can never capture the subjective experience of such prolonged agony. Medical historians believe he suffered from several simultaneous conditions that created a perfect storm of illness. Advanced diabetes mellitus, probably type 2 given his age and lifestyle, would explain poor wound healing, edema, kidney failure, and increased susceptibility to infection. This was complicated by severe gout, cardiovascular disease, and possibly cancer, though the latter is harder to confirm from surviving descriptions. The bedsores that dominated his final suffering were pressure ulcers, now called decubitus ulcers, which develop when sustained pressure cuts off blood flow to the skin and underlying tissue. In a bedridden patient with diabetes and poor circulation, these ulcers develop rapidly and become nearly impossible to heal. Modern treatment requires regular repositioning, special mattresses, and aggressive wound care. In 1598, none of these methods existed. The maggot infestation, though horrifying, was a common complication of infected wounds in the pre-antibiotic era. Flies laid eggs in exposed wounds, and the larvae fed on necrotic tissue. Ironically, modern medicine has rediscovered that sterile maggots can aid healing by consuming dead tissue and secreting antibacterial compounds. But nothing about Philip's infestation was sterile or beneficial. These were ordinary flies depositing eggs in a septic wound, and the larvae only drove the infection deeper. Philip's prolonged survival despite massive infection demands explanation. Without antibiotics, widespread bacterial infection usually leads to septic shock and death within days. Some medical historians speculate that Philip's body, over the long course of illness, developed a kind of grim equilibrium. His compromised immune system could prevent the infection from becoming immediately fatal but could not clear it. Another factor may have been Philip's overall constitution before his final illness. Despite his sedentary habits, he had reached the age of 71 in an era of low life expectancy and had survived multiple earlier illnesses. His fundamentally robust constitution may have helped him endure, and in a tragic sense, condemned him to 53 days of dying. The psychological dimension of Philip's suffering must also be considered. Modern medicine recognizes that mental state profoundly affects physical health and pain perception. Philip's deep religious faith may have given him psychological resources that enabled him to endure what would destroy most people. His belief that his suffering had meaning, that it was a test or purification, may have helped him maintain mental coherence even as his body failed. Yet this same faith may have prolonged his ordeal. Had he surrendered, allowed himself to slip into unconsciousness, and let nature take its course, he might have died more quickly and peacefully. Instead, his determination to remain conscious, to participate in religious observances, and to maintain his role as king for as long as possible may have kept his mind active in ways that prevented his body from shutting down. The broader historical significance of Philip's death extends beyond the medical details. His passing marked the end of an era. Philip II was one of the final great monarchs of Renaissance Europe, a man who embodied the medieval ideal of divine right kingship even as the modern world was beginning to emerge. His prolonged, horrific death seemed to symbolize the demise of an entire worldview. The Spanish Empire he ruled would endure for centuries, but it had already passed its peak. The failed invasion of England in 1588, the ongoing wars in the Netherlands, and the mounting economic strain of a global empire had weakened Spanish power even in Philip's lifetime. His death removed the last strong hand at the helm, and his successors proved less capable of managing the immense inheritance he left behind. The manner of Philip's death also profoundly affected those who witnessed it. The physicians who attended him carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some wrote treatises attempting to understand what had happened, though their conclusions were shaped by the limited medical knowledge of their era. The servants and priests who tended to the king were traumatized by what they saw. Some requested transfers or retired from service. For the Spanish people, and for Europe more broadly, the news of how Philip died was deeply unsettling. This was an age that believed in the divine right of kings, in the idea that monarchs were set apart by God's will. Learning that a king could die in such a degrading and horrific manner challenged basic assumptions about divine protection and royal sanctity. If God's anointed could rot alive, consumed by worms while conscious, what protection did anyone have? The Catholic culture of the time was deeply preoccupied with death, judgment, and the fate of the soul. Philip's prolonged suffering was interpreted by many as a sign of divine judgment, though what sin could merit such punishment was widely debated. Others viewed it as the ultimate test of faith, a trial through which Philip proved his endurance and maintained piety. Some Protestant writers used his death as propaganda, arguing that his suffering was God's judgment on a monarch who had persecuted Protestants throughout his reign. Philip had indeed been a fierce defender of Catholic orthodoxy, supporting the Inquisition and waging wars against Protestant nations. His death became a talking point in the religious conflicts of the era, evidence seized upon by both sides in their theological disputes. Yet beyond the political and religious interpretations, Philip's death carries a more universal message about human mortality. This was a man who commanded the greatest empire of his age, who signed orders shaping the fate of millions, who possessed wealth and power beyond measure. And in the end, he suffered and died in a manner that stripped away every illusion of dignity and control. His death reminds us that regardless of worldly power, we remain vulnerable to the failures of the body, the ravages of disease, and the inevitability of death. The 53 days of Philip's dying also raise profound questions about medical ethics that remain relevant today. When does treatment become torture? At what point should caregivers stop trying to prolong life and instead focus on minimizing suffering? These questions were not formally articulated in 1598, but they were implicit in the choices made by Philip's physicians. Every time they changed his dressings, every time they attempted a treatment that caused him pain, they were choosing to prolong a life that by any reasonable standard was no longer worth living. Modern palliative care and hospice medicine emerged partly from the recognition of cases like Philip's, situations where aggressive treatment served only to extend suffering without offering hope of recovery. Today we understand that there is a time to stop fighting death and to prioritize comfort and dignity. But this wisdom came at a cost, paid partly by people like Philip II, whose agony revealed the need for more humane approaches to terminal illness. The account of Philip's death has also fascinated medical historians as an unusually well-documented case of what happens to the human body under extreme conditions. Most people in the 16th century who suffered similar afflictions died quickly and without record. Philip's status ensured that every detail of his condition was observed, noted, and preserved. His suffering became a kind of grim medical record, a chronicle of what the human body can endure and what it looks like when it fails in the most catastrophic ways. There is something almost incomprehensible about 53 days of such suffering. Most of us struggle to imagine enduring that level of pain for 53 minutes, let alone nearly 8 weeks. Yet Philip lived through it, conscious and aware for most of that time. The human capacity for endurance, it seems, exceeds our ability to imagine it. We can survive conditions that should kill us, sometimes to our misfortune. The legacy of Philip's death influenced royal medical practices in later centuries. The Spanish court became more cautious about treatments given to royalty and more willing to acknowledge that some conditions were beyond medical help. True progress, however, would wait for the germ theory of disease, antibiotics, modern wound care, and all the medical advances that would not exist for centuries after Philip's death. Today, someone with Philip's conditions would still face serious challenges but would not die as he did. Diabetes would be diagnosed and managed. Infections would be treated with antibiotics. Bedsores would be prevented with specialized equipment and regular care. Pain would be controlled with effective medications. And if death were inevitable, palliative care would ensure as comfortable a passing as possible. The gap between 16th century medicine and modern practice is perhaps nowhere more evident than in comparing Philip's death to how similar cases are treated today. Yet even with modern medicine, we have not eliminated suffering. People still die in hospitals after prolonged illnesses that erode dignity and autonomy. We still wrestle with questions about when to treat and when to let nature take its course. We still face the universal human experience of watching the body fail and knowing death is inevitable. In this sense, Philip's death, despite its historical distance, remains relevant. It reminds us that no matter our technology, we are mortal and we will all face our end. The story of Philip II's death is ultimately a meditation on mortality, power, and the limits of human endurance. It shows that worldly power means nothing against bodily decay, that faith may bring comfort but cannot prevent suffering, and that the human body can endure conditions that seem impossible. It is a story difficult to hear, difficult to imagine, and difficult to accept. But it is true, documented by multiple sources, and deserves to be remembered. 53 days. 1,272 hours. 76,320 minutes. Every one of those minutes was experienced by a conscious human being whose body was decomposing while he still lived. The mind struggles to comprehend such an ordeal. We instinctively recoil from imagining it in detail, yet the historical record forces us to acknowledge what occurred. Philip II died as perhaps no monarch before or since has died, slowly, painfully, in a manner that mocked every pretense of royal dignity and divine favor. His death stands as a stark reminder of our shared humanity and vulnerability. In the end, the king who ruled an empire on which the sun never set could not command his body to heal, could not control the manner of his dying, and could not escape the universal fate that awaits us all. The small chamber in El Escorial where Philip died was eventually sealed and became something of a macabre shrine. Visitors to the palace can still see the room, though it has been modified over the centuries. A small plaque marks it as the site of Philip's death, but nothing adequately conveys what took place there in the summer and fall of 1598. Perhaps no words could. In the centuries since Philip's death, medical science has transformed our understanding of disease and our ability to treat it. We can prevent, cure, or manage conditions that would have been fatal in the 16th century. Yet we still cannot eliminate suffering, cannot fully control the process of dying, cannot escape our mortal nature. Philip's death, despite its historical distance and unique horror, reminds us of truths that remain eternally relevant. The king who rotted alive for 53 days, whose body became host to worms while he still breathed, who endured unimaginable pain. Philip II of Spain died as a man stripped of all royal pretense, reduced to failing flesh and a spirit that somehow endured. His death stands as perhaps the most horrific recorded in royal history, a testament to both human fragility and human endurance, a reminder that in the end, we are all equal before mortality. As we conclude this account, we must sit with the discomfort it evokes. There is no redemptive ending to offer, no lesson that makes the horror palatable. Philip suffered terribly and died badly. His faith may have comforted him, but it did not spare him. His power proved useless against the decay of his own body. His physicians could do little but witness his agony. In the end, death came not as a welcome release but as the inevitable conclusion to an ordeal that should have ended weeks earlier. We do not tell this story because it is uplifting or because it offers simple moral clarity. We tell it because it is true, because it happened, and because bearing witness to even the darkest aspects of human experience helps us understand what it means to be human. Philip's 53 days of dying stand as a monument to human suffering, a reminder of how fragile we are beneath all our pretensions of power and permanence. In the royal pantheon beneath El Escorial, Philip II lies in a marble tomb befitting a great monarch. The stone is cold, dignified, and permanent. Nothing in its polished surface suggests the manner of his death or disturbs the solemn atmosphere of royal repose. But history remembers. The accounts endure. And the story of the king who rotted alive for 53 days remains one of the most horrifying deaths ever recorded. A reminder that in the end we are all vulnerable, all mortal, all subject to the ultimate democracy of death that respects neither power nor position. This is the legacy of Philip II of Spain. Not only the empire he ruled or the wars he fought, but the manner of his dying, 53 days of suffering that defy imagination and demand remembrance. A story that haunts history. A death that stands among the most terrible ever documented. And a reminder that even kings are only human, only flesh, only temporary inhabitants of bodies that must inevitably fail.